Hello friends, it is I, your host, GM Danielson, coming to you with our latest video. Of course, winter is almost over, but not really on the channel. I mean, it's just like Halloween, really. It's 24/7, 365. Insofar as we can try, though. Gather round the fire, friends. Bring your favorite drink, did you? Well, I hope it isn't bourbon, because I have a weakness for bourbon. But let us get on to our first story, friends, by Gorilla of Undeath, titled, I Woke Up to a Freezing Cold Blizzard. If everyone receives this message, please send help. I live in Redacted, and my family and I are in dire need of assistance. We are freezing to death and need help now. I know this is all confusing, but my fingers are so cold. We can't get out of our house. Let me start from the beginning as best I can. I woke up in the middle of the night to sounds of my mom and dad moving in the living room. It was freezing, like brutally cold. A kind of unnatural cold that seeps into your body and remains there no matter how many blankets or layers of clothing you put on. I could only lay there in my bed, frozen by the cold. I wondered why it was so damn cold. When I went to sleep, everything was cozy. I had snuggled into bed under layers of warm blankets and fell into a deep sleep, only to be awakened by the cold. I heard my older brother stir from his room next door and trot down the hallway to join Mom and Dad in the living room. I could hear whispers of concern and worry, and I thought something bad was happening. I checked my watch, saw it was 3:22 in the morning, way too early for any of us to be awake. But I guess the fact that I could see my breath meant that something was wrong with our house and our heat. For the house to get this cold in a short matter of time seemed bizarre. What are we going to do? We're not going to freeze, I heard my mom whispering. We're going to freeze. We're not going to freeze. We'll have to get a fire going. Adam, I'm going to need your help, Dad said. I heard Adam let out a long sigh before moving to help Dad. I took in a deep breath, preparing myself for the grating cold that would assault me when I pushed the blankets from my body. But I had to know what was going on. I pushed the blankets off quickly and scrambled for the dresser drawer to find a warm pair of fleece-lined pants, a hat, and 2 hoodies. There was no way I wanted to put on my proper winter coat to sit in the house. It just didn't seem right at all. I met the rest of my family in the dark living room. My mom sat on the couch dressed in warm clothes and with several blankets around her. Our eyes met, and she called me over and tossed me a few spare blankets, shivering all the while. I could see the digital thermostat said the room was currently only 23 Fahrenheit. My dad and brother were trying their best to light a fire, but they didn't have enough good kindling to really get it going. Black smoke billowed into the room, making us all cough. Damn it, my dad shouted in frustration. Dad kept lighting pieces of newspaper, trying to get a large log to catch on fire, while my brother kept fanning the flames, hoping to get it going. We kept a few pieces of wood in the house for emergencies, but the vast majority of our firewood, like everyone else's, was kept in a small shack on the line of our property. I don't think we used the fireplace more than a handful of times in 5 years. What's going on with the heat? How did it get so cold in here? I asked. Heaters are broken, it seems. There must be some sort of freak storm out there because the temperature really dropped. It must be in the negatives out there, Dad said with a frown. Is the fire almost ready? Mom asked. It's not starting. All our kindling is outside. We'll need more firewood too eventually, even if we do get this goddamn thing started. I'll have to go gear up and grab some." Adam chimed in at that moment. "I'll go out there and get it. You stay in here and keep trying to light the fire." Dad seemed hesitant at first, but granted him permission. "All right, but don't mess around out there. Just get the wood and come back. Too cold to be out there for too long. You'll get frostbite." Adam seemingly brushed this warning off. He was cocky and usually dismissed my parents' advice. He was the rebellious one, while I was typically more level-headed and rational. What am I saying? I was a goddamn pussy compared to Adam. Adam went back down the hall for a few seconds. I looked to my dad, who kept trying to light more newspapers in an attempt to get the log to catch fire. My mom only pulled her blankets around her tighter as she desperately watched to see if the fire would start. I pushed up one of the blinds to try to see outside, but found that all the windows were frosted over, making it almost impossible to see anything clearly. You could make out shapes and colors, but beyond that, there was not much of anything you could see. I could see large snowflakes coming down out there. Apparently, a snowstorm had blown in unexpectedly. I turned back to see my brother emerge from the hall, dressed in his large winter coat and decorated with a thick hat and heavy gloves. He carried a large sled that was slung over his back and held with a rope. "This is going to be sweet," Adam bragged. Dad looked at him angrily. "What the hell is the sled for? You are only supposed to get some firewood and kindling and come back. The house is freezing. This isn't time for you to mess around." Yeah. Of course the sled is for wood and stuff. I can drag it through the snow in this. It'll be easier." Dad couldn't really argue with that logic, I guess. He certainly could bring back more wood on the sled than carrying it by hand. I followed Adam to the back door. I wanted to see what was going on outside. At the time, I was curious how a storm like this had come on with no warning. Adam opened the door quickly, revealing clearly what was going on outside. I took a peek and saw snow piled high and more falling in almost blizzard-like conditions. Shards of ice hung from the roof of our house like cold daggers. In the distance, through the hazy wall of snow and ice, I swear I could see a human-like figure illuminated by a subtle blue light. It waved its arms in the cold night. It seemingly had no lower torso that I could see, only an upper torso that seemed to connect to the snow or something. It swayed back and forth in an almost rhythmic motion. A shudder ran through me, and I instinctively blinked. Then I could see nothing but the blizzard continuing to rage. A frigid wind pushed its way into the house with a roar that chilled me to the core. The house creaked as the strong wind buffeted the sides. I watched him shut the door behind him, fighting against the strong wind that so desperately wanted to invade more of our house. I ran over to the windows to peer out and saw his silhouette grew smaller and smaller as he made his way over to the wood shack. We sat in the living room and waited for Adam to return. My dad kept trying to light the fire while Mom went to work making us coffee and hot cocoa to hopefully help warm us. I sat down on the couch with a cup of hot cocoa and saw my dad struggling to keep the log burning alongside sips of his coffee, but the log continued to scorch and smoke up the place. We drank our lukewarm beverages and waited, and waited, and waited. Dad by this time had given up on getting the fire going without some proper kindling or smaller pieces of wood. Eventually, we began to grow concerned. It shouldn't have taken 20 minutes to gather a few pieces of wood and kindling from the shack. The three of us were by the windows, trying to look for a sign of him. I went over to the window again and tried to look out to see if I could get a view of him. I could see that figure again, or at least the outline highlighted by the blue light. The silhouette danced in the blizzard. Looking at it made me feel cold and hollow, but I couldn't determine what it was through the frosted glass. I was about to call my dad over to look at it when he started speaking. "What the hell is keeping that boy? I better suit up and go find out what's going on out there. Seems it's getting even colder. We need to get this fire going." Dad was right, of course. The house temperature had dropped to 16 degrees, and if things continued, it would get even colder. My dad piled up the blankets on one of the windows, trying to look outside to see what was going on, but a thick layer of ice kept us from really seeing too much, save for murky silhouettes. I put my face closer to the window. I could feel the cold air seeping through our house, eradicating the remaining warmth our house held. Suddenly, a loud crack rang through the house as something smashed into a window. It cracked, and I jumped back as my mom let out a shrill scream. Dad turned towards the source of the noise. "What the hell was that?" Dad yelled. Something hit the window. It's cracked," I said. "What was it? I know it's windy out there, but to crack a window like that?" "I don't know what it was, but something definitely hit the window. I think there might be something else out there." "Something else out there? Like an animal? I don't think birds are flying in this weather. I'm going outside. I need to see what is going on out there. I need to find Adam. He's probably messing around building a whole snowman family or sledding down hills like I told him not to. We need to get this place warm soon, or the pipes will freeze and burst if they haven't already." "No, I don't know. It looks like someone off in the distance is waving their arms." Jeez. Probably your idiot brother messing around out there. I told him this was important, and of course he didn't listen. This time, I volunteered to go outside with my dad and help him. 2 of us could carry more wood, or at least I could look to find Adam and bring him back on to his task. Things were beginning to look dire for us if we didn't get the fire going. I put on my heaviest coat, snow boots, hat, and gloves. Dad and I made our way to the back door. I was feeling a bit nervous about the whole thing. There was no way that figure was Adam. Outside was colder than I expected. The cold went right through my coat and clothing. I couldn't believe Adam would want to be out in this, even if he did want to go sledding. I followed behind my dad as the blizzard raged, and about halfway to the woodshed, we saw the sled. It was mostly buried under falling snow. There was wood on it, but with it being covered in snow and mostly frozen, it was now useless. My dad pulled the sled from the snow and pushed the frozen wood off. "I need to get dry wood. You go look for your brother. He couldn't have gone far," Dad yelled at me. My dad's form quickly faded as he walked off into the blizzard. I turned and went the other way. Visibility was getting even worse than when I had looked out the front door before, and there was no way I could stay out here for that long. I walked around yelling my brother's name again and again, trying to get him to come out. My toes and fingers were already beginning to feel cold. It was then I started hearing a crunching noise, like someone was walking through the snow, following me. I thought it might be Adam trying to scare me, staying just out of sight to mess with me. I was honestly getting pretty scared. My heart beat fast. Being out in the freezing dark of night was not all that fun, and I had an intense feeling that I was in danger. I had seen something strange earlier and was already feeling nervous when I came out. A figure finally came into view, and I felt a moment of relief. But as the figure drew closer, my relief turned into sheer horror when I realized it was not Adam. It was not my dad either. It was something else shambling towards me. Heavy footfalls left imprints in the snow that quickly froze over. I could feel cold radiating off this thing as it grew closer. A frozen eyeball hung from its eye socket. It wore clothes that were torn and ragged, revealing bluish-gray flesh that was definitely unnatural. Icicles hung from the ends of its clothes. There were holes in its skin exposing grim yellow bones. Some protruding out had frozen over. The thing stepped toward me, and I instinctively began moving away from it. It opened its mouth, letting out a noise that was a mix between a roar and a moan, before snow poured out of its mouth and onto the ground, adding to the already deep snowfall. I screamed and darted off away from this thing. I didn't even go toward the house, I was so panicked. I didn't know what the hell this thing was, but I knew I had to get the hell away from it. I heard it following me for a bit, but it couldn't match my speed as I trampled through the snow. I tripped and fell. My body sunk into the cold snow, and I actually began to feel warm. They do say that people often feel warm when they are starting to freeze. Adrenaline pumped through me as I pushed myself to free myself from the snow. I tried to calm myself down. I cupped my hands over my eyes to try and see where I was, the snow now a nearly blinding blizzard. Not far in front of me was a large pile of snow. It was unnatural. No one had shoveled it there, and there were no plows around that could have piled the snow that high. I eyed the pile for a moment with suspicion and fear. I realized I needed to get back home, but as I was about to run off, bits of snow began to roll down off the pile before greater cracks appeared. Suddenly, a skeletal hand pierced the barrier of the snow, causing more snow from the pile to fall to the ground. A skeletal head appeared, unnatural blue light escaping from its sockets of the skull. There was a distinctive crown of ice that almost sparkled. I stood paralyzed with fear, or maybe it was the cold. I felt colder than I have ever felt before as I realized that this was the thing I had seen earlier. It had been covered in snow in that short amount of time. It shook its head, causing more snow to fall from the pile and hit the ground before starting to move its long, lanky arms that pushed the majority of snow off it. It had an upper torso, but its lower torso was seemingly nothing more than snow and ice. I could only watch in horror as the thing placed a hand onto the ground. Moments later, there were areas of blue light seemingly penetrating the thick snow around me. I watched as more and more spots began to get that sickly bluish glow. And then they all faded. The snow affected by that blue light all began to crack and move on its hands, and then bodies emerged. They were the same as the thing I had seen earlier, bluish-gray skin and ragged clothes. The cold was almost unbearable now. I couldn't feel my fingers or toes, but I knew I had to move as the things began to wail and shamble toward me. I was so scared as I ran to the house. I could hear the footfalls of those zombie-like things following behind me as fast as they could. When I reached the house, I felt a sense of relief, but as I ran past the cracked window toward the door, my foot stepped on something, causing me to nearly trip and fall. I quickly took a moment to dig around the snow and pulled out something heavy and covered in frost and snow. I turned it over in my hand and brushed off some of the snow, terror flooding into me as the snow fell from the object. Cold, dead eyes stared up at me, the visage frozen into a look of pure terror. It only took me a second to realize what it was as I dropped the thing and turned to vomit. It was Adam's severed head. One of those things must have gotten to him. I ran inside the house and panicked with tears in my eyes. The house was warmer now, and my dad was there by a healthy fire, taking off his winter coat and hat. "Did you find Adam?" Dad asked. I couldn't muster a response. How the hell could I tell him that Adam was dead? I tried to keep my tears back, but they came out anyway with heavy streams. I blubbered like a baby for a moment, trying to compose myself. Yeah, my brother was kind of a dick, but he was still family. I figured my dad would think I was being a baby or mock me, but a serious look of concern came over his face. My mom had got up too, and now eyed me curiously. I didn't want to be the one to break the news. "What's wrong? Where's Adam?" Dad asked me again. I didn't answer him, only stood there crying. My mom put her arm around me and sat me down on the couch. My mind was a mix of grief and fear. Those things were still out there. It took a moment of crying before I found my resolve to tell them what was going on. "There's these things out there, a lot of them now. One got Adam. I think they're coming this way." They didn't even have time to process what I was saying when a heavy thud came from the side of the house. We all stopped for a moment and listened. Then there was another thud and another. Suddenly, the cracked window from earlier broke, and one of those things toppled in, bringing with it a stream of cold wind. Snow steadily poured from its mouth. What the f*** is that?" Dad shouted in horror. The thing lunged at my dad, sinking its frozen teeth into his neck. Dad screamed as it tore into him, blood squirting from his neck in a vicious spray that coated the thing's face. Dad kicked at the thing, sending it toppling to the ground as another had begun to crawl in the window. It grabbed my mom's hand, who stood there shocked and screaming in terror. He clutched his other hand at his bleeding neck. More of them were entering the room through the window now. I heard a boom as our door toppled to the ground, and more of those things poured into the room, bringing with them snow and ice. We ran down the hallway to the basement. It had a heavy door of steel that we were able to lock and keep those things out. That brings us to now. I can hear their footsteps and moans above us. It's slowly getting colder down here. We were able to stop Dad from bleeding, but now he has some sort of frostbite and has fallen unconscious. Mom just sits in the corner crying and crying and crying. It's so cold down here. I don't think we have long. I called 911 and they said they were sending someone, but that was half an hour ago. I don't think they can get through the snow and ice. This is my last attempt to get help. Please, for the love of God, help us. The Girl in the Snowstorm by Foggy Glass Eye. I've seen her again, the girl in the snowstorm. I didn't know that I was in danger the first time I saw her. On the contrary, it was an experience that I kept thinking about all winter. It was over a decade ago, and I was visiting a friend that morning to drop off a Christmas present for him. It was a few miles from home, but I enjoyed the walk, despite it being an even colder winter than usual. My mother had warned me to return home soon, as the local news was predicting a blizzard that evening, so I kept my visit brief and started home that afternoon. By the time I'd made it halfway, the wind was brutally cold, and the snow was falling so heavily that I could barely see where I was. It was too late to turn back and bunker down at my friend's place, so I had to keep walking home. I wore glasses back then, switched to contacts a few years ago, and had to take them off. It was bad enough to see everything as white blurs, but it was impossible to see anything through wet, snow-covered lenses. Walking through a blizzard without being able to see is a helpless feeling. You can only hope that you're heading the right way, fighting the wind, not to just stay upright, but to make sure that you don't lose your sense of direction. You can't see nearby buildings very well, and you're constantly on the lookout for familiar sights that can tell you where you're at. I followed the sidewalk as best I could, occasionally stepping off the curb onto someone's lawn. It was in this blurry haze of wind and snow that I first saw the girl. The first thing I noticed was the red scarf blowing madly in the wind. She was walking in the opposite direction at first, and it looked like she was on the other side of the street. The closer she got, the more I questioned what direction I was looking in. Was she crossing the street, or was I not walking on the sidewalk anymore? I could barely tell where I was. I took a moment to make sure I was still on the sidewalk, and by the time I confirmed where the girl was, she was only a few yards away. I could see her more clearly. She was wearing a mismatched assortment of winter clothes and a lot of layers, even 2 hats. Her puffy blue jacket was oversized and unzipped, and underneath I could see that she was wearing another heavy coat. She didn't look intimidating at all. On the contrary, she looked very vulnerable. She was short and notably thin, almost unhealthily so. I was almost 10 at the time, and I imagined that she couldn't have been older than that. The way she was bundled up in so many layers of clothes made her look uncomfortable and gave her an uneven, lumpy shape. I assumed at the time that she was poor, maybe even homeless. Instead of walking past each other, we simply stopped in front of one another. Something compelled me to stare down at her, and she looked up at me with a sort of vague expression. Her hat scarf covered most of her face, leaving only her eyes and a part of her cheeks visible. Her eyes were so big and dark, like little black holes against her pale skin and the surrounding snow. I lost myself in her stare, like I was falling into her very eyes. It was like I was in some sort of trance, pulled to her without realizing it, making me utterly passive. She took her earmuffs off, but didn't speak. "Hi," I said weakly, not knowing what to say. She looked me up and down, and something about that look made me shiver, even in the cold. It was like she was taking stock of me, of what I had to offer. Before I could ask what she wanted, the girl held her hands up. They were pale, shaking and bare. The girl didn't have any gloves. Something about the way she looked at me so impatiently made me look down at my own gloved hands. I didn't have a particularly good set of gloves, but they were the only pair I had. I looked at her again, and something about her big dark eyes made me want to give them to her. I took my gloves off and held them out for her to take. I almost regretted it, but then her freezing hand touched my bare skin as she took them, and they were so cold that I knew I was doing the right thing. She put the gloves on, looked up and smiled. The scarf was still covering most of her face, but I could see in it how her cheeks raised up and in the sparkle of her eyes. As she started to walk past me, I realized the blizzard was easing up. I put my glasses on again, turned around and looked at the girl. She had stopped walking and was staring down at the gloves, I assumed admiring them. "Merry Christmas," I mumbled to myself as she looked back at me, almost as if she heard me over the wind. I waved, realized my hands were cold, and shoved them into my jacket pockets. She nodded and turned around, continuing her walk to wherever she was going, but not in any sort of hurry. I was only a block away from my house, so my hands weren't cold for very long. When I walked inside, my mother immediately noticed that my gloves were missing. For some reason, I didn't tell her the truth, despite how chivalrous it would have made me look and sound. I lied, suggesting that I must have forgotten them at my friend's house, and then went up to my room. Something about the girl made me want to keep our interaction private, like it was something special. I sat down on my bed and mulled over what I'd just experienced, and just done. I didn't exactly have a crush on the girl, but something about the way she stared at me was so compelling, like I was defenseless against it. I wanted to see her again. I looked out from my bedroom window, somehow expecting to see the girl, and she was there, on the other side of the street. It was like she'd been waiting for me to want her to be there. I opened my window, blasted suddenly by cold air, and waved at her. She waved back, then started walking away. I watched her walk out of view, wondering who she was, where she had come from, and if she was ever there at all. Something about her, though, felt unreal, like I'd vividly imagined her. I hoped to see her again that winter, but never did. Whenever I went outside, shoving my hands into my pockets, I wondered if she still had those gloves. Whenever I got home, I checked through my window to see if she was standing on the other side of the street again, waiting for me like she had that first time. I daydreamed even about running into her during one of my walks, which just so happened to become more and more frequent. But I never saw her. Not as a child, anyway. That year was memorably cold. Blizzards moved in and out. Roads were all slick with ice, and inches of snow fell every day. We always had some snow, but that year was bad. This winter has been pretty heavy so far, but not on that level. We've had a lot of snow and ice, but no blizzards yet. It's the perfect kind of winter for long walks in the snow. Last week, I was enjoying the season and going out on a long walk. It was snowing lightly and the sky was a solid white of clouds. It was a very peaceful walk at first, but then I saw something in the distance on the other side of the street. It was a girl, short and bundled up in layers of winter clothing. Most of the clothes were different, but the red scarf brought me right back to that meeting a decade before. It was her. I'd been obsessed with this girl since childhood, reminded of her every winter for years. It was like opening a time capsule of memories buried in the back of my mind since I was in middle school. But at the same time, it was more than memories. She was standing right across the street in mostly different clothes, but the girl was the same size, the same height, like she hadn't aged a day. I was lost in that impossible thought, wondering if she was just really short and petite, when I realized that she was crossing the street and heading in my direction. Does she recognize me? I wondered. I couldn't move, and I didn't want to. Something was so disarming about this surreal sight of this girl from 10 years ago. I remembered wondering as a child if I'd imagined her all up. Hadn't she followed me home and waved at me from across the street, though? Did I just make that up and forget that it wasn't true? She stepped right in front of me and looked up. I remembered how I'd looked down into her large eyes, so dark that they looked black against the white of her face and snow. And here we were again. I was an adult, sure enough, and she was still a child. Her scarf still covered up her lower face just as before, but I could see from the upper half that she looked exactly the same, like she walked through time to see me again. However, the clothes she had changed. Her scarf was worn and stained, her jacket ripped in some places. She had a different pair of gloves on that looked fairly new, and I wondered if some young boy gave them to her. Did he also think he had imagined her? She looked me up and down, and I remembered that she did the same thing the last time, taking stock, I assumed, in the moment that she was looking for something to ask me for, another article of clothing to keep warm, and I was right. She settled on my scarf, and she lightly tugged on it as if demanding it from me. I pulled off the scarf, ignoring how cold it suddenly made my neck, and handed it over. There was something so strange about the experience that I just felt like I had to go with it, if only to see where it was going. Like before, I was compelled by something in her stare to do what she wanted. I was transfixed by this impossible girl. Then she removed her red scarf, and I almost let myself scream. The skin of her mouth and chin was stained red, and large fangs jutted down amongst her upper teeth. She looked up as she dropped her old scarf on the ground and started putting mine around her neck, giggling at the sight of my fear. I was grateful when she covered her mouth with my scarf, but still terrified. I was glued to the spot, but desperately wanted to run. She had a sort of disarming aura about her, but it was gone, replaced by danger. I felt compelled to get away from this bloody-mouthed child, but I was frozen in place at the same time. She laughed again, the light and innocent joy of youth. And then she spoke for the first time.
I remember you. Did you move?
I shook my head slightly, unable to move. I couldn't stop staring at her eyes. At first, I'd assumed they were brown and simply looked darker in contrast to the light. But now I could see the endless pits of blackness in her eyes. I could feel a sort of force moving from her eyes to me, compelling me to stay put and do what she wanted. She had me under her spell, and she knew it. It was funny to her, and she loved it.
Oh, I think I remember where you live then,
she said before giggling again.
Thanks for the scarf and the gloves. Stay warm.
She walked past me. I heard her footsteps in the snow get farther away, but I couldn't will myself to turn around. I didn't want to see her right behind me, admiring her new scarf as she'd admired the gloves I'd given her a decade ago. Would I have waved at her too if she was there? I imagined that I would have, if I had the feeling that was what she wanted. When I got home, I locked the doors and windows, willing myself not to look out and see if she was there waiting for me again, like she had been the first time. I haven't left the house since. I've tried to convince myself that she was imaginary, but I'd rather be terrified than let myself believe that I am crazy. My mom asked me if I was okay yesterday. I brushed it off and asked her about the heavy winter a decade before. She recalled that it was particularly bad, even worse than they had thought at the time. When I asked what she meant, she told me that the local news kept running stories that following spring about a few missing people who'd been found after the snow all melted away, dead on the side of the road, as if they'd just keeled over and been covered by the snow without anyone noticing. My mom also remembered that one of the missing was from this side of town. I've since looked into it, and this side of town is really only a mile or so away from our home. The article I found mentioned that the person who discovered the body said that there was dried blood on their coat and neck, like they'd cut themselves falling, and bled to death right by the sidewalk. I have my own theories. You may be wondering why I'm staying indoors when the girl from the snowstorm knows where I live. The thing is, I'm not sure she can enter my home without an invitation. Either way, I'm not going to risk going outside again. Not that I have the courage to do so in the first place. I can barely will myself to look out the window at this point. I don't know what to do besides share my experience with all of you, in the hopes that you are also careful this winter. Even if you are not a local, there is no telling how many of these things are out there. And if you have to go outside, bundle up. Stay warm. I hope these winter stories certainly gave you a memorable chill. A dark chill too. I look to see you again, friends, for the next video, as well as winter 2021, when I shall tell you more scary winter stories. In the meantime, friends, I am your host, GM Danielson, and this is Horrorcraft.